I kind of have multiple different hats that I wear depending on the specific circumstances as they relate to chameleons.
In this adventure, I speak with Dr. Chris Anderson. We discuss the three hats he wears: chameleon and other exotic pet breeder, leader of the university-based chameleon lab, and finally, an official member of the team determining the international trade status of chameleons. He is living the dream. Buckle up, this adventure starts now.
To the music! All right, welcome adventurers. Today I have Chris Anderson. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Dr. Chris Anderson. I am a professor of biology at the University of South Dakota. I work with chameleons in my lab for my research. I'm also the chair of the IUCN's Chameleon Specialist Group, and I've been keeping and breeding chameleons for about 25 years now.
Wow, that's a lot. I'm not even sure I knew that much about you. I always learn something about people on these podcasts. So how would you define yourself then? I think you kind of did, but can you do it again for the adventures?
Yeah, so my interest in chameleons started off as a hobbyist, and keeper. And over the years, I've bred various species, and I think I would still consider myself a hobbyist and keeper. But on top of that, I also work with chameleons professionally as a biologist, professional herpetologist, among other different subsets of biology. And in my lab, we study chameleons. I've studied them in the wild, in the lab, and in captivity. But then also I have this hat where I'm also a conservation biologist and help to further the conservation of chameleons in the wild. And so I kind of have multiple different hats that I wear depending on the specific circumstances as they relate to chameleons.
That's kind of like a dream life for most of the people that listen to this podcast. So how did you get into this? How did this happen?
Yeah, so I first got interested in chameleons when I was in about eighth grade, and I wanted to get one as a pet. And my dad, growing up, had previously kept chameleons. My father and uncles and grandfather all had exotic pets living in Southern California, and they had Jackson's chameleons back in the '60s, keeping them outside and so forth in that environment. And so he was aware of some of the challenges of keeping chameleons and was a little bit hesitant to just let me go into chameleons without some education, let's say. And so he and my mom made an agreement with me that if I read everything I could about chameleons and their care and worked on understanding what they needed for 6 months, and I was still interested in getting a chameleon at that point, then they would let me get a chameleon. And so I did. And this was back in, the AOL Instant Messenger days where, I was on some of the AOL chat groups for pets, talking to, chameleon keepers and breeders around the world. Some, that are big names in the industry to this day, published books and so forth. Talked to basically everybody I could, got every book I could find, read every website that was available in those days, found email listservs of other chameleon keepers, and really just dove deep into what it would take to work with chameleons, and ended up getting a pair of veileds as my first chameleons. Enjoyed them, and it kind of just snowballed from there, where I just continued to read anything I could, talk to anybody I could, pick up any little bit of knowledge I could, started working with additional species, and eventually I would say that kind of that interest and experience with them in captivity led to a broader interest in them and their biology, their natural history. And I had always been interested in reptiles and amphibians, and I had kind of decided from a young age that I wanted to, grow up and get my PhD and become a herpetologist. But it was, through that experience working with chameleons in captivity that I really started to focus on chameleons more broadly. And a lot of the interest in the biological questions that I have is based on my experience with chameleons, and that all started with keeping them as a hobby in captivity.
Wow, what 8-year-old has the patience to do 6 months of research?
Well, eighth grade. It was eighth grade.
Eighth grade, okay, eighth grade. All right, so I was wrong, but it's still eighth grade. Who has the patience to do 6 months of stuff?
I think that it was subconsciously a little bit of hoping that it would fizzle out and I would move on to something else, but it didn't. So yeah, they kept their word and we got a chameleon.
So was that your first exotic pet?
No, so I've grown up with exotic pets. Like I said, my grandfather and my father and uncles, they all had exotic pets growing up. I grew up going to my grandfather's and he bred parrots and other birds. Growing up, my dad had bats that they would catch and flew around their room when they were doing their homework. Otters, skunks, like you name it, they had it growing up. And so growing up, I had everything from the typical dog and cat to chinchillas and sugar gliders and leopard geckos, ball pythons, whatever snakes or lizards we had caught recently that I was keeping for a little while before letting them go. Various frogs and just all kinds of things. I had quite a number of exotic pets and so forth up to that point.
So what was your first exotic pet? Do you remember?
My first exotic pet was actually, I think, in kindergarten. My parents got me an ornate or a ceratophrys Pac-Man frog, and I also had fire-bellied toads. And so those were my first, I think, exotic pets that I had myself, and was responsible for their care and everything. And that was, like I said, a pretty young age, kindergarten, first grade.
Starting off very young on
Yeah.
all these things. What exactly is your PhD in?
Yeah, so my PhD, the degree is in biology with a concentration in physiology and morphology. And essentially, most graduate programs in the US, you'll have the degree will be in biology or sometimes zoology or sometimes integrative biology or some derivation thereof that's fairly broad. And then occasionally you'll have opportunities to specialize, but that'll be in like ecology and evolution or physiology and morphology or things like that are still fairly broad. There's not really many opportunities in the US to actually get a degree in herpetology, but really, the research that you do and the expertise that you gain is more specialized than that specific, degree category, if you will. And so my research during my PhD was on feeding in chameleons, and in particular on how temperature affects their feeding performance, and kind of diving into the mechanistic basis for how chameleons project their tongues and retract their tongues. And, fundamentally, their tongue projection has extremely high performance because it's powered by the recoil of elastic tissues, whereas the retraction of the tongue is powered directly from muscle contraction without that preloaded energy that's stored in the elastic tissues. And so my research was really kind of fundamentally looking at how temperature differentially affects those two types of movements. And chameleons, were a great system for this because they have very exaggerated feeding mechanisms that in a single feeding, you have both movement types. And so it was kind of a built-in control and comparison for my research. And so, I'm a broadly trained as a biologist, but specialized much more specifically from there, but still kind of can place myself into the category of a physiologist or an ecologist or a herpetologist or an anatomist. So there's a whole wide number of kind of subcategories that my research is involved in.
So what was your hypothesis for the tongue feeding? What was
So the hypothesis for the chameleon feeding stuff for my PhD was that elastic recoil was going to liberate tongue projection from a lot of the strong thermal effects that otherwise impact muscle-powered movements. And so if you think about most reptiles on cold days, they're kind of sluggish, they're out basking until they can elevate their body temperature and then move more quickly. And that's because muscle contraction is fundamentally a physiological process that is tied to the temperature that process is occurring at. And because reptiles can't maintain their own core body temperature through metabolic processes, it's affected by their environment. But when they preload elastic elements and the movement is then powered by those the recoil of those elastic elements, that's no longer that recoil is no longer a chemical process. That's a structural response. And so you basically move from a situation where the muscle contraction is going to lower the speed at which those tissues are stretched. But then the recoil of those tissues, once they've been stretched, is almost insensitive to temperature effects. And so there was a number of different experiments we did throughout my dissertation, kind of breaking down the motor control patterns and how those are affected by temperature for the different muscles that are involved. I did muscle contractile physiology in vitro, so taking living muscle tissue out of the specimen and maximally stimulating it to determine what its physiological capacities were at different temperatures. And then I also did some comparisons among species that live in different thermal environments to kind of delve deeper into this mechanism and see really what's going on. And one of the cool things is that this basically allows chameleons to temporally expand their thermal niche. And what I mean by that is that first thing in the morning, when other lizards that live in the same habitat are basically catatonic and can't chase down prey, chameleons are able to capture prey, consume them, and then wait for their body temperature to elevate where they can then start to digest efficiently.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, I love chameleons. I've got a bunch of them,
Yep.
but I don't let them get low enough to assume that they're not going to be moving or whatever. But and I've heard that chameleons are just like, in some areas, are just like iguanas. They fall out of the trees and they get up and come back to life. I've never actually seen that because I don't have that.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got that kind of cold here in Ohio.
There are species, particularly at high elevations, that the temperatures overnight can get below freezing, and so they basically retreat into the deeper portions of their bushes and so forth to protect themselves. But oftentimes, when they wake up, or in the morning, their body temperatures are right there, right around freezing, and oftentimes they'll fall off the trees. They'll basically be black. And there's cases where people have kept them in captivity and tried to replicate some of those processes with those same species, particularly like in the UK. And they pick them up and think, okay, they froze overnight, they're dead. And, over the next hour or so, the sun comes out and they slowly warm up and they start crawling back up the tree. So yeah, Hohenelli is a great example of that. Actually, Bradypodon thamnobates is another one. Both of those species, it gets below freezing in their habitat. Bradypodon thamnobates, you'll get snow, and they go into kind of these, dormancy states, but even sometimes daily activities where they, first thing in the morning, are extremely cold.
That's cool. I don't want to torture my chameleons like
Yeah.
that, but I guess if it's all in for science,
Mhm.
right? All right. So, what actual species do you have now?
Right now, I mean, I have chameleons in the lab. I have chameleons at home. I have, a number of different species. I have a few different species of Bradypodon that I work with in my research. I've got Jacksoni, multiple subspecies. I've got Caloptratus, of course, veiled. Let's see, what else do we have I've got Archaeus tigris, the Seychelles tiger chameleon. I've got Furcifer rhinoceratus. I've got Bruxia stumphi, Furcifer lateralis. I've got Kaluma betkeri. I've got quite a few different chameleon species.
Is there a number now for how many species of chameleons there are? I know.
Yep. So the current number of described species that are at least kind of widely recognized, and you get some varying opinions on whether one species is a full species or one species is a subspecies or just a locale variant. But the current best estimation is that there's 228 chameleon species that are described, but just about every year there's new species that are described as well.
Yeah, I was telling everyone 212, so I got to catch up. Do you have anything other than chameleons?
I do, yeah. So I have chinchillas still. So I actually started keeping chinchillas when I was in second grade, and I have this bloodline that I've had going since I was in second grade. So I have chinchillas as kind of my furry, cuddly, exotic, in addition to having dogs and so forth. I have various turtles and tortoises. So I keep my wife has a pet redfoot tortoise, but I have a number of critically endangered Malagasy tortoises, the Pyxis genus, the Madagascar flat-tailed or flat-backed tortoise, as well as the spider tortoises of a couple different subspecies. I also have a number of turtle species. So I have fly river turtles. I have Indian spotted pond turtles. Then various gecko species. So I have a couple different species of Nephurus, knob-tailed geckos. I have Nephurus amii and Nephurus asper. I have corkbark leaf-tailed geckos, Europlatus pechmani. I have a few different species of day gecko. So I have the electric blue day geckos, Ligodactylus williamsi, neon day geckos, which is the Phelsuma clemeri, the standings day gecko, Phelsuma standing eye. What else? I think that about covers the pet.
Wow, I can't believe you remember that entire list.
I have to in
But
my head
you
go
know,
around the room and
yeah. Okay, that's a good way to
yep.
do it. But so, have you ever vended at a reptile show?
Yeah, so I've never had my own table, but I've helped friends vend, and so um, when I first moved to Florida for my PhD work, I was good friends with Mike Monge, who at the time owned FL Cams, and he since sold it many years ago. But at the time, he was doing a lot of the breeding himself. He was going to importers and getting additional species. He was hatching Mellors, Cristatus, Duramensis, numerous species at that time. And I would help him at a lot of the reptile shows. And so for a few years, I vended regularly at Florida reptile shows, at the Daytona show, the various Repticon shows, and fire shows, and so on down there. I also went out to California and vended a couple shows with them out there, and I think that's about all of them. But for quite a number of years, I was vending quite a few shows with him.
So, what were the Florida shows like?
Yeah, so the Florida shows really varied a lot depending on the size of the show, the location, and also, over those few years that I was doing it, kind of when in that period we're talking. Kind of earlier on, those Repticon shows were really just starting to expand quite a bit. And we were going from a situation where we had, you know, a few shows here and there in Florida with decent chunks of time between them to towards the end it seemed like almost every couple of weeks there was a show somewhere within a 3-hour radius of me in Florida, it seemed. And so a huge amount of variation in those type of shows, and then it goes up to talking about the Daytona show, where that show was huge, particularly at that time, and hundreds of vendors and a huge number of guests and so forth. And so some of those shows were single night or single day shows, with a relatively few amount of vendors. And then other shows were just massive and, full weekend shows with Friday events and so on.
Wow, yeah, like Bill and I, as we were talking about the different types of shows, monthly small shows, which most people get to talk to each other, pick up their supplies. Then there's the quarterly shows like Tinley or Pittsburgh Mega Show or what have you. And then there's the shows that are in the middle. And we weren't able to define the shows. We just defined the small and the large, and everything else that wasn't small or large ended up being that way. So yeah, I just attended the Michigan Reptile Show yesterday, which is supposedly in Taylor, Michigan, is their largest reptile show, but they're just outside of Detroit. But Detroit, you can't own a reptile there.
Oh,
I
really?
mean, you can't own a turtle greater than 4 inches, which is weird because I don't think you can buy a turtle less than four
Yeah.
inches. So it's one of those situations. So they were going to have a venomous show. The one that the people who ran the mega show out of Pittsburgh come there and have a venomous show, and they got all the permits and everything together. But the vendors all said, "No way, I don't want to go into Detroit proper and do it because they don't allow reptiles." And what will people be? Will be somebody outside the door arresting everybody who walks out, or what the heck will
Yeah.
happen? So it's strange because they have all these reptile shows. Detroit is not a place to have reptiles. So
Yeah, interesting. And so when I was doing in undergrad, I was living in upstate New York, and so I used to go down to the Hamburg show, which is a big venomous show, and some of those. And yeah, so I would say the Hamburg show is one of those kind of quarterly, intermediate sized shows, but a lot of different stuff being a venomous show.
what are you working on personally or work wise, as long as you can talk about it, obviously?
Yeah, so personally, I've got various projects that I'm like non-chameleon projects that I'm raising up animals to breeding age to hopefully get them breeding more. A lot of my day geckos I breed quite regularly and sell those to or trade those with other breeders. Chameleon wise, I don't typically work with veiled or panther chameleons or some of those species that are easier to breed. Personally, I focus more on more oddball species, and so I kind of classify my efforts with them is constantly trying to breed and usually having less success than I would like. And chameleons are challenging. They're tough, particularly some of these other species. And so I'm constantly trying to tinker with my husbandry and improve things, make it more realistic for what we're seeing in the wild, and stimulate some of that breeding. And here and there, I have success with various species, and other species less so, and so on. And so that's kind of what I'm doing, kind of privately, at home. And then in the lab, I have various projects going. So I have 5 PhD students in my lab who are working on their dissertation research, plus accelerated master's student, and a whole slew of undergrad researchers who are doing honors theses or various research projects. And most of those focus on chameleons. And so some of them are focused on chameleon feeding, and particularly looking at how chameleons' specialized tongue apparatus has evolved, and what the limitations of that are. I have individuals in my lab, some of my students who are working on evaporative water loss data on chameleons. And so looking at both cutaneous and total evaporative water loss, so that we can start looking at how different species and species living in different habitats vary in that regard. I have a student who's working on metabolic rates in chameleons, looking at body size effects, as well as phylogenetic and environmental effects on metabolic rates. I have a big grant right now working with Bradypodon, various species of South African chameleons, looking at how some more expansion work on some of my PhD work, kind of looking at how thermal adaptation plays into temperature effects in feeding in chameleons. And so that sees me going to South Africa every year to bring back additional species from different locations and different habitats, and doing temperature effects feeding experiments. I have students who are working on chameleon locomotion work. I have students that are working on kind of pure morphology work with chameleons, particularly a lot of like CT scan work. It's pretty varied. I have a lot of little projects going on all over everywhere.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you could have any reptile that would be legal to own, and it doesn't matter how many permits you needed,
Yeah.
what would you own?
Oh boy. I would have to say a chameleon would be included in there. And there's a few species of chameleons that I've worked with over the years that I can't get anymore, or that I would just love to be able to work with and haven't been able to. I'd have a tough time narrowing it down to one, but a couple of them would be, I really loved working with Bruxia perimata, which is the armored dwarf chameleons from Madagascar. They're CITES Appendix 1 now. You can't get them. They were fabulous, just fascinating animals. I would love to work with them again. Rampholion spinosus was a small arboreal chameleon species from Tanzania called the rosette nose chameleon. That's a beautiful species that I'd love to work with again, as well as Kinyongia tenuis, which is the Usambara soft horn chameleon. And Trioceras lateraspinus is just a fantastic species. And so I've worked with each of those species before and had a lot of success keeping them. I didn't have any success breeding any of those particular species, but those would be ones that I would definitely want to keep again. I really, really love working with the Pyxis tortoises, the spider tortoises, and the Madagascar flat-shelled or flat-tailed tortoises. I really enjoyed working with them, and so I would probably want to keep working with them. And up until recently, I also kept Boelen's pythons, Morelia, or I guess it's Similia boeleni now. I had them for 15, almost 20 years. I would love to get a good size breeding group of them and work with them some more.
We got your Christmas wish list,
exactly.
I got. Just in time for the season. So
tall orders there. And stuff that is available still is pretty penny these days.
So this is called the Reptile Show Reporter. So let's talk about Reptile Show, at least.
Yeah.
What would be the perfect reptile show from your personal perspective? If you went to a reptile show and this was the perfect one, how would you describe it?
Yeah. So I think my favorite reptile shows have always been the kind of quarterly to annual shows. They're bigger shows. They bring in, a wide range of vendors from a broader area. I like how those shows tend to bring in some keepers that are working with highly specialized species that you don't just see at every show. Some particularly unusual animals. So I like those, like a Tinley or a Daytona show or a super show where you really are starting to see some specialized, interesting, unusual stuff. But I also actually really like some of the shows that have a fair bit of wild caught diversity as well. I mean, of course, healthy wild caught where it's not just right off the boat or been in a box for a week waiting for the show, but well cared for unusual species. So I think for me, diversity at the show is really key. When I go to a show and it's all ball pythons and leopard geckos and crested geckos and similar type diversity, I enjoy the show and talking to people and picking up my supplies and seeing some of that stuff. But what I really get excited about is when I go to a show and I see something that I actually haven't seen before at a show, or species that are quite unusual and somebody's been doing well with them, and that diversity and dedication is really something that I really enjoy from some of those bigger shows like that. And so Hamburg show is one that I used to go to um, outside of Philadelphia, as I was going to Cornell for my undergrad. And that was a really interesting show. It had a lot of diversity. It was a venomous show. It also allowed imports. There was a mix in quality of the imports, but there was, always some really nice animals that were imports and unusual species. And so some of the interesting things that I've worked with over the years came from shows like that. So looking at amphisbinians and stuff like that that I was able to get, and Sicilians that are not really mainstream that you see very often, but finding them at those shows and knowing what they were and being able to see them and then possibly work with them was fantastic. But then from a vending perspective, I really enjoyed those bigger shows too because of the social aspect of it. So the Daytona show was a fantastic, as well as the Super Show, were fantastic shows to vend at because it was 2 full days. But on Friday there was always with the vendor setup, there was events and talks and the auctions and various nightly activities that were going on. And it was a really incredible fun experience always to go and talk at the at dinner and the bars afterwards with other people that some that have been friends for years, some that I've kept up with really well over the years, and then people that I just don't see very often but were attracted to those shows. And so for me, kind of that community, that diversity of species, but also like those specialized kind of niche keepers and breeders that are doing great things. Those are kind of pieces that I love about some of those shows.
I think that one of the things we're missing at some of these smaller shows is the not the get together community, but it's
Yep.
education, the talk, the socialization, because they're only a few hours
Yep.
once a month, and you get to know the people very well. But there isn't talks,
Mm.
and they're at the last Tinley they talked about New Caledonia and all the other geckos, and they actually introduced a new species from New Caledonia that was in the United States. I don't remember exactly what it was, but Adeline Robinson had drawn it out and what have you.
Huh.
But and for heck's sake, Adeline Robinson got married during the auction at the last show.
I saw photos. Yeah. I I haven't been out to a Tinley show. I've been to various of the other NARBC shows over the years, and Tinley's high on my list of it. It seems like one of those shows that is kind of my ideal type of environment that over the years I've really loved. But yeah, I saw some of the photos from that show, and that's kind of that sense of community that I think is so incredible about some of those big shows. The fact that yeah, some of the vendors are actually getting married there at the show. It really kind of goes to show you just how connected that the community can be in some of those events.
That's definitely the type of show that you described because I was there a couple weeks ago. It was an incredible show, and the atmosphere, everything was great, and they even had the booths separated.
Hmm.
Like they had something stanchions that go up to the ceiling, and so you didn't feel like you were in a huge show. You felt like every row was the whole show.
Very cool. Yeah, that sounds like a show that I definitely need to make a point to make it out to.
What are your goals? I mean, do you have specific goals?
So again, it depends on which hat I'm wearing, I think. I would say as a private keeper, my goal has always been to leave us better educated about the animals than we were before, and kind of trying to continuously move us forward as a hobby, as keepers, as breeders, as enthusiasts. Keep us pushing the envelope and improving our success rates and so on. When I first started keeping, and it still kind of persists a little bit, but of course, everybody insisted that you could only keep chameleons in screen enclosures. And over the years, I've started pushing really about actually glass terrariums can work really well for a lot of species, and it turns out create much more naturalistic environments for many of these animals, and highlighting the fact that we always say, or we've always pushed this idea that chameleons can only be kept in screen enclosures, yet out of 228 chameleon species, and many of which have been available over the years in captivity, we've only successfully established a handful of those. And so that's not exactly great success rates that support this idea that this is the only way that we can do it. And so I think just kind of teaching people to think outside the box and think about these husbandry techniques as tools to achieve an end goal, which is replicating the natural environment in a way that promotes the animal's long-term survival and well-being, but also captive breeding is a major goal of mine. And that's kind of expanded a little bit as I've had my hands in other fires, to increasing the education about among the community about sustainability and legality of the trade, and making sure we're being smart about the species that we're trying to get and we're working with, and are conscientious about the threats that these animals have with our own, for lack of a better word, consumption. And so I would say that kind of education component and trying to advance the hobby is kind of my major goal. Broadly, as a hobbyist. Specifically, there's varying goals that I have about some of the different species that I'm working with, successfully breeding those and trying to hopefully establish some of those. But that's, I would say that at the broader level, kind of as a hobby, what I'm focused on. From the perspective of my hat with the chameleon conservation with the IUCN's Chameleon Specialist Group, one of those is education as well. And so that's kind of where there's overlap, and educating people on the diversity of chameleons, the conservation situation for chameleons broadly, but also for various species, trying to help ensure and facilitate conservation assessments so that we know where to target resources and efforts, and do what I can to hopefully prevent the conservation situation for most species getting any worse than they are. And hopefully, again, trying to improve the situation, or at least put us on better footing, that we know what we need to do, or know better what we need to work on to conserve some of those species. And then finally, with research in the lab, really pleased now that I'm starting to train my own students, and foster an interest in chameleons broadly with them. It's interesting, if you look at other groups of reptiles like crocodilians or something, we're talking about 20 some odd species, and iguanas, more species than that, but not all that many species, and so on. And there are dozens and dozens and to hundreds of researchers around the world that work with them. But if you think about chameleons, chameleons are a group of animals that have fascinated naturalists and scientists since Aristotle. If you mention a chameleon to somebody, pretty much everyone in the public would have an idea of what a chameleon is. They have a picture in their mind of a chameleon. They know about the color change or the tongue projection or some aspect of chameleons. And there's 228 species across 12 different genera. They're incredibly diverse and interesting, but there are only a handful of people really in the world who are working with chameleons. It's just a little bit mind-boggling that you have such disparity. And so I would really like to foster more of a focus among the scientific community in working on chameleons and learning more about them and their natural history. And I think that that will also hopefully help with their conservation status as we get more people that are looking at the chameleon diversity and concentrating on different species and so on. Many species, just by virtue of the fact that they live in remote areas, that there's few people working on them and so forth, don't end up getting seen or documented by scientists or researchers or naturalists of any type for decades. And it's just simply because there's not enough focus or people working on them. And so for me, I'm interested in answering some questions that have fascinated me since I started learning about chameleons and advancing that knowledge. But I also think that supporting and nurturing that community that's working with chameleons and trying to improve or increase that community size would be a huge goal.
I guess I was going to ask you next, if there's anything left that you want to share with the adventures, but I think probably you put everything into words.
Yeah.
Anything else that you wanted to tell our adventurers about you or your goals?
Yeah. So, one thing I would say is, chameleons are fascinating animals. They can be challenging and heartbreaking all at the same time. We're constantly learning about them and improving our own understanding and practices, but also, learning a lot about them in the wild and so forth as well. And I think one of the things is it's critically important for everyone to strive to improve their own husbandry, but make strides among the community so that we can hopefully establish a lot of these species in captivity, because in the long run, there's been many chameleon species that have been available over the years that gradually dwindle as far as their availability as different countries close their doors to exports, or we learn more about how threatened the species is in the wild, and their trade has to be reined in. And it's one of those things that if we knew then what we knew now, how far would we be at this point, with establishing some of those species? And so if we can continue to always push ourselves and advance the hobby and advance the understanding of the chameleons and our techniques, I would say that that's kind of a huge goal that we should all have.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a huge chameleon fan, as you know.
Yeah.
But that's a good thing about it. Pretty much every species we talk about. If people want to reach out to you, how would they best do it?
Yep. So I have a website online. It's Chamaeleonidae.com. So the scientific family name for chameleons. It's my lab website. It has like high-speed videos of chameleon feeding, has some information about some of the projects we have, but it also has my contact information there.
Okay.
And that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. You could also search for the IUCN's Chameleon Specialist Group, and there are Facebook groups for that, Twitter, and websites. And you can contact me either. Some of those have my direct email, but others have the Chameleon Specialist Group's generalized email, and I can be reached on either of those as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our adventures will.
It was good talking to you.
Please join our Facebook group, Reptile Show Reporter, pictured here. Thanks.